Hi, welcome to Woody Minis. I've been getting a lot of questions on Instagram about how I made this Telemon Dreadnought, so I'm going to show you. First up is the base. I needed to make an overgrown temple so it would fit in with the rest of my army theme. I added on lots of acrylic paste, and then I added some columns to be a fallen temple. I finally sprinkled on some rocks, and you can get these free outside. And when it was all done, I could start working on assembling the model itself. This one's made of resin, so you will need to use super glue instead of plastic glue. I turned his head to make sure he's looking the direction I wanted his fist to be firing. I absolutely love the head and the decal on this. The torso of this model is really easy to assemble. It's got lots of cool little decorations and lots of patterns and imperial insignia on it. It's a very standard fit and it's quite easy to assemble, but you do have to make sure that you try and avoid all the gaps. That circle there is where the rocket pod's going to go. It's just a fixed pose rocket pod. It looks really cool, but we're going to be doing something special to it later by adding some firing weapon effects. I wanted it in an act of firing, so I turned it as if it's targeting something and then raised up the end of the rocket pod at an angle. Now that the main body was assembled, I could start to attach it to the legs and play around with the poses. I'm just using some blue tack just so that I can adjust things as needed, find something I like before I commit with the super glue. I always do this for my kit bashes, conversions and poses, especially centerpiece models like this one. You can see that this gun and arm are entirely held together by blue tack. After sticking it on quickly and making sure it wasn't too loose and easily manipulatable, I started looking at the other arms as well. I'm really liking how his torso is fitting, how his arm is just casually hanging back whilst he shoots his other fist.
It's now time for the weapon effects.
I started off by cutting off some of the tips of these rockets, and then, using a 3mm drill, drilled in a small hole where the missing rockets would be firing. By snapping some 3mm brass wire, bending it into a pose, and sticking it in the hole, we've created just the base for some rocket trails from his firing weapons. With this all done, it's time to finally start supergluing him together, because I'm really happy with the pose and how he's looking at the moment. Of course, it wouldn't be a good build without using magnets. You never know how the datasheets are going to change, so I started by simply putting in some 3mm neodymium magnets. The Forge World kit has some good spots for them, so there's no extra drilling needed in this bit. This is going to make him easier to transport, as well as giving me some weapon options if I ever do decide to finally play a game of 40k. After checking through all the poses, I realised I did need to adjust it a bit because he does look like he's out bird hunting. I'm using putty here to sculpt on some flames for the firing weapon effect. I start by sticking out 5 little bits of putty and then inserting some wires into them. I pinch and pull with some sprue clippers to get the basics of a flame, and then start moulding it and pushing it with some wet sculpting tools. I want it to be really quite violent and explosive, and using this beginner's method was really simple. After playing around to make sure everything's in the right place, I sculpted on the tips of the rockets, and then used a knife to serrate some edges to make it look like just some flames shooting out the back of the rocket. After priming, this is what it looked like. Next step is painting. I'm using Hex-Ray Flame for the rocket trail, something really bright,
Like a dark side I-beam.
I'm then colouring in the tips of the rocket with some striking scorpion contrast green to help it stand out. Once this is done, I did the same thing, striking scorpion green for all the flames. Once all of the flames were painted, I then added a little bit of fire going up the rocket trails, give it a bit of contrast. I dry brushed some dryad bark over everything else to be the end of like a smoke trail. Once done, I realised that the flames needed to be brighter, so I coloured on some bright white, and then I mixed in some fluorescent green pigment from Green Stuff World and some white paint and painted on the flames of the rockets. With this done, it was time to work on the big blocks that need to be coloured in. I like to do a marble scheme, so I'm covering the whole thing in a 1-to-1 mix of 2 different contrast paint, Guilliman Flesh and Skeleton Horde. Once that's done, I use a wet brush to stipple in areas of a pattern. Then I use streaks of the same contrast paint and go over some areas to add in some marbling. I repeat this step a few times just to get a better colour, a bit more contrast between them. Then using a damp brush, I take away the edges of these streaks to leave a fine line and a soft gradient like you'd see in naturally occurring marble. The end effect is pretty cool and I've been using it in almost all my minis so far. I also go over it several times just to make sure it's in the right place I want, with some finer zigzags. Pretty cool. Next up is gold. I'm using Balthazar gold here, just because I don't want to use something too bright that takes away from the marble. There's a lot of details on this model that need to be painted, so it takes quite a while. After covering in all the shoulder pads, all the rocket launchers, all the legs, details, gemstones, everything, the model was starting to look really cool and almost exactly like I imagined it. Painting this model took me maybe 20 hours in total, but I'm not a very careful painter, and you'll see why. And it's because I get to hide all of my mistakes for this army in Overgrowth. I'm going to make a cape for him using tree moss powder and some super glue. Just by using some simple addition, putting on a dab of glue, sticking the tree moss powder, I was able to create a really cool cape. It took about 20 minutes, but it wasn't too bad. After a quick test to make sure it's secure, I continued with the cape, adding a bit more, until it was looking nice. It was hanging a bit too far away from his body, so I put some super glue down there and pressed it in. After testing the pose again with the finished cape, I was looking really happy with it. It was then time to add overgrowth to the rest of the model. I then needed to add more overgrowth to cover up all of my quick painting mistakes and areas that I just wasn't that happy with. I just applied PVA glue and then used some green flock to cover them up. This stuff's pretty bright and it looks great from a distance by itself, but if you look closer it can be a bit like little green rocks. So to fix this problem, I take some drops of Beal Tan Green shade and add them on top. It helps it blend in with the rest of the mini and stand out less with a darker shade of green. And no overgrowth would be complete without some grass tuft, so finding some spots on to put in some dark grass tuft with the tweezers, again using some super glue so that it dries quickly. I also added a few grass tufts to the hood of his cape, as it just helps with a bit of colour variation. I then scrunched up some dried twigs and put them into his torso gap to help it look like there's a tree growing inside him. We're on to the final details now. So what I'm going to do is look over the model and see if there's anything I've missed, and yes I have. I've missed on the glow of the rocket pods and weapons. Using some striking scorpion green contrast, I cover all these areas and get a dry brush ready to go over the top of them to add some OSL. He's starting to look almost finished. But with this many weapons on one model, there's always a little bit more to do. The final thing to help him stand out was some fluorescent green pigment, which I mixed with white and then added to his eyes to really draw some attention to his face, because otherwise there's just too many details going on. The last step was the base. I just added a lot of wraith bone to the pillars with a really quick, easy paint job, followed by some Agrax Earthshade all over the ground and the floor on the base to give it a really earthy look. It's a really quick and easy job to do bases like this because the colour of the acrylic texture paint we've put on is already quite earthy. I then stippled on some grey to the pillars to add some colour variation and dry brushed a bit on the edges as well to give it a subtle edge highlight. The final step was to add all these grass tufts to the base to make it a really forest theme. I wanted some bright colours, some dark colours, everything to give it some interesting things. And this is the final result. One Custodes Telemon Dreadnought. I've decided to call him Mossicus Maximus, as I've just seen Gladiator 2. Do you think the name suits? It was really fun to make this guy, and I'm so happy with how he's turned out. He looks truly unique, deadly, and in the heat of battle. He's going to be an excellent centerpiece for the rest of the Woodstodes army. I've really enjoyed making this YouTube video. The next one I'm going to post is going to be converting the Stormcast Black Talons into Sagittarium Guard Squads. So hit subscribe and the notifications if you fancy giving some support. I appreciate it, guys. Bye.